Welcome back, everybody. We're going to look now at Act 2 of Romeo and Juliet. Now, once again, we have a prologue, and the chorus delivers another short sonnet describing the new love between the love-struck Romeo and Juliet. Now, the hatred between the lovers' families makes it difficult for them to find the time or place to meet. And how do they let their passion grow? But the prospect of their love gives each of them the power and determination to elude any obstacles in their path. And in scene 1 is where we get the most famous quote from Romeo and Juliet ever. And it goes, "But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun." Well, that's almost as amazing as "Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?" You see, this is where we have what we call the balcony scene. So what happens here is that, having left the feast, Romeo decides he can't go home. He's too excited. He must try and find this beautiful young girl, Juliet. So he climbs a wall bordering the Capulet property. He leaps down into the Capulet orchard, and Benvolio and Mercutio enter, calling out for Romeo. Now they're sure he is nearby, but he doesn't answer. Exasperated and amused, Mercutio mocks Romeo's feelings for Rosalind in an obscene speech. It's pretty foul, actually. And Mercutio and Benvolio exit under the assumption that Romeo doesn't want to be found. Now, in the orchard, Romeo hears Mercutio's teasing. He says to himself, he jests at scars that never felt a wound. Oh, of course he's going to tease me. He's never felt the way I do. I mean, really? Okay, so Juliet suddenly appears in the window above the spot where Romeo is standing, and Romeo compares her to the morning sun, far more beautiful than the moon. He sees her sighing and putting her hand on her cheek. He says, "Oh, I wish that I were a glove on that hand so that I can touch those cheeks." I mean, honestly. Okay, so he nearly speaks to her, but thinks better of it. Juliet, now thinking to herself about Romeo, and she's unaware that he's in a garden, asks why Romeo must be a Romeo. And if he's a Romeo, then he's a Montague, and he's naturally an enemy to her. She says that if he refuses his name, she will give herself to him, or he would simply swear that he loved her. She would refuse her Capulet name. So you see how dramatic this is getting. Now Romeo immediately responds and says, "Hell yes, let's do this." So he surprises her because she thought she was alone. And she wonders how he found her, and he tells her that love led him to her. So they deal with the whole sort of romantic thing about him professing his love and her professing her love for him. And he reassures her, and the two confess their love together over and over. Now, in the background, the nurse calls for Juliet, and Juliet goes inside for a moment. When she reappears, she tells Romeo that she will send someone to him the next day to see if his love is honorable and if he intends to wed her. Well, the nurse calls again, and again Juliet withdraws. She appears at the window once more to set a time when her messenger should call on him, and they settle on 9 in the morning. So they exult in their love for another moment before saying goodbye. And Juliet goes back inside her chamber, and Romeo departs in search of a monk to aid him in his cause. Now, the prologue to the second act reinforces themes that have already appeared. So there's the charm of looks, there's the force of parental influence that stands in the way of love's happiness, and this prologue functions as the voice of fate. And it kind of just leads the viewer as an audience member or the reader. And you can see that there's a little bit of a problem building, and there are things that are going to happen, and we get the sense of anticipation that, uh-oh, this is not going to end well. You see, Act 2 is the happiest, and it's the least tragic act of the whole play. Now, in it, Shakespeare devotes himself to exploring the positive, the joyful, the romantic aspects of young love. The balcony scene, it's just so full of love, and so many modern people today still quote from Shakespeare from this specific scene to exult and to profess their love for each other. Now, many of the scenes in this play take place either late in the night or very early in the morning, because Shakespeare must use the full length of every day in order to compress the action of the play into just 4 days, because the whole thing happens in no longer than 4 days. So now Romeo, of course, when he's talking to Juliet, is being very metaphorical. Juliet is not the sun, and it's still night in the orchard, right? But he says, oh, her beauty outshines everything. And the metaphor is rolling here continuously. See, for Romeo, Juliet is the sun. And yet in the same speech, Romeo and Juliet also question the power of language. "'Tis but thy name that is my enemy. Thou art myself, though not a Montague." What's a Montague? It is not hand nor foot. I mean, it doesn't mean anything. None of this means anything, but for some reason we seem to be at war with each other. And she asks Romeo, why do I have to be your enemy? Why must we be enemies? And the social world, the language of society holds sway. Now, the battle of language in which Romeo and Juliet try to remake the society in which they live, we need to keep an eye on that. Now have a look at throughout this scene, scene 1, we can actually determine that there is something is building up. It's beautiful, but it still leaves us with a sense of discomfort. Well, in scene 2, everything happens. You know, the Friar Lawrence enters holding a basket. He fills the basket with various weeds, herbs, and flowers. And while thinking about the beauty of the earth, he demonstrates a deep knowledge of the property of the plants he collects. So Romeo enters, and Friar Lawrence says, "Uh-oh, Romeo, you haven't slept, have you?" And he fears that Romeo may have slept with Rosalind, which is a sin, because you can't do that before marriage. They have a little bit of a discussion around that. But Friar Lawrence is shocked when Romeo confesses, no, he's in love with Juliet, not Rosalind anymore. And he comments on the fickleness of love. Yeah, youngsters, love one day, love somebody else the next. And he starts talking about his hope that the marriage of Romeo and Juliet, because he finally agrees to marry them just to keep this young man quiet, might end the feud between Montagues and Capulets. And things like, okay, so if these two do get married, it could actually end up stopping this nonsense fight that's been going on for generations. Later that morning, just before 9, Mercutio and Benvolio wonder what happened to Romeo. And Benvolio learns that a servant that Romeo did not return home. Now, Mercutio spouts some unknown and very unkind words about Rosalind, but Benvolio also relates that Tybalt has sent a letter to Romeo challenging him to a duel. Oh, Mercutio then says, don't worry, Romeo's already dead. He was struck by Cupid's arrow and he fell in love. They have a big joke around all that kind of thing. Now, Romeo arrives, and Mercutio immediately starts claiming that Romeo has been made weak by love, as a way of mocking what he believes is Romeo's overdone love for Rosalind. Mercutio takes the part of Romeo and compares Rosalind to the most famous beauties of antiquity, like the history of some of the most famous people of the world. This gets a little bit bawdy and very, very sexual in its joking around. It gets very... So the nurse comes in, she's trailed by her servant, and she asks if the 3 young men know Romeo, and Romeo identifies himself. And Mercutio teases the nurse, insinuating that she's a harlot, in other words, she's a little bit of a tart, thus infuriating her. Now, Benvolio and Mercutio take their leave, and everything goes, and things seem to be going okay. But Romeo asks the nurse to tell Juliet to find some way to attend confession at Friar Lawrence's cell that afternoon, because he wants them to get married. The nurse agrees to send the message. She doesn't know that Juliet is going to get married to Romeo. She just knows that it's time for Juliet to go and attend confession. And so they move on. The nurse agrees to set up a cloth ladder so that Romeo might ascend to Juliet's room on their wedding night. Now, in the scene, we're introduced to Friar Lawrence as he meditates on the quality of good and evil and all that exists. And speaking of medical plants, Friar claims that though everything in nature has a useful purpose, it can also lead to misfortune if used improperly. Now there's an important section, because that is a foreshadowing of what is to come. You see, it is the friar who provides the sleeping potion that we see later on, extilled and distilled from the plants that he harvests. Now, the role of the friar in Romeo and Juliet is hard to pin down. Now, so clearly, he's a kind-hearted man and he's friend to both Romeo and Juliet, and he seems wise and selfless. But while the friar appears to embody good qualities that are often associated with religion, he's also an unknowing servant of fate, because he's the one who does all the plans, and they all go to heck, all right? There are plans go awry, there's misunderstandings, and all of that misunderstanding leads to the final tragedy.